Welcome to China Considered, a podcast that brings fresh insight and informed discussion to one of the most consequential issues of our time, how China's changing and changing the world. I'm Liz Economy, Hargrove Senior Fellow and co-director of the program on the U.S., China, and the World at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Bonny Lin. Dr. Lin is the director of the China Power Project and a senior advisor at CSIS, think tank in Washington, D.C. She also spent several years working in senior positions on Asia in the Department of Defense. Welcome, Bonny.
Great to be with you.
So, Bonny, I want to touch on three broad issues with you today. First, just what are China's security ambitions? Are they basically to supplant the United States as the dominant power in the Asia Pacific, or are the ambitions bigger than that, or are they smaller than that, in fact? Second, what about Taiwan? It's an issue that I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about. Is Xi Jinping 100% committed to claiming sovereignty over Taiwan? Is the Chinese military ready to take action today if need be? And then what is the story about Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign in the Chinese military? I mean, I think we can look back to 2012 when he first came into power, and then into 2013, and we saw a lot of churn, throughout the Chinese political system, including in the People's Liberation Army, in the PLA, in terms of senior officials and actually many junior officials as well, getting purged, getting arrested for corruption. But we're now 13 years on. So I'd love to get your insights into why this is still going on. At this point, he's purging people he appointed. So those are the topics I want to cover with you. And so let's just start off with the biggest, picture one, which is talk to us a little bit about China's security ambitions. What do you see as the trajectory? What do you see as inflection points? What's his ambition?
Right. Well, thank you, Liz. So I think China under Xi Jinping is very, very ambitious. And in terms of what Xi Jinping wants, it is not just China to be the dominant actor in the Indo-Pacific. I think Xi Jinping wants China to be either on par with the United States or even more leading the international world, leading the world to the extent that China is number one. In terms of inflection points on the security side, I would note this again goes back to how active Xi Jinping is. If you look at what's been happening since Xi Jinping's been in power since late 2012 to 2013, we've basically seen a major change almost every 2 or 3 years. So the first one is, for example, in the South China Sea, which actually your book covers quite well. From late 2013 to 2016, we saw massive island building from China in the South China Sea. That's unprecedented. We've often seen China ramp up and down tensions in South China Sea, but we've never seen the island building to the extent that we saw under Xi Jinping. My colleague Greg Polling has done some excellent statistics on this, and he's shown that since 2013 to now, we've seen China reclaim over 4,000 acres of land in the South China Sea.
Wow.
And the difference between prior to Xi Jinping and now is by now, particularly since 2018, we now see China's maritime actors basically able to sustain paramilitary operations in the South China Sea on a day-by-day basis, whereas before we would only occasionally see Chinese maritime actors by the various disputed features. The other major change I would say that we've seen under Xi Jinping, which is only about 2 or so years after the massive land island reclamation campaign, is in 2015, Xi Jinping engaged in a massive reorganization of the PLA. So starting in late 2015 and continuing for quite some years, and even now, it's arguable whether the PLA reforms have been done or not. We saw change across the board. So previously, China was organized around 7 military regions. Under Xi Jinping, he changed the number from 7 to 5. And each of the 5 theater commands now are no longer just administrative actors. They actually control the forces and can execute joint operations within their theater command. At the same time, while we see the massive military reorganization, we also saw at the central level changing from 4 major departments, 4 general departments under the PLA to 15 different agencies. We saw changes across the services. So China used to have three major branches, the PLA Navy, PLA Army, and PLA Air Force. The Rocket Force, which controls China's missile assets, was elevated to a full service under Xi Jinping. And then China also added in the PLA Strategic Support Force, as well as the Joint Logistics Force. As part of this major overhaul around 2017, 2018, we saw Xi Jinping cut about 300,000 people from the PLA, mainly from the army side, because at that time, the Chinese military was about 70% ground force. So he wanted to have each of the forces to have a little bit more equity. And then we also saw the change of the Central Military Commission, which is the top body within the Chinese military. It used to be 11 people in the Central Military Commission. Now it's, about half a year ago, it was 7 people. Now it's down to 4 people, which we can talk about later. But it showcases the centralization of power under Xi Jinping and the demotion of other military leaders, such that Xi Jinping himself has the most power. So all of these changes within the PLA have caused experts to say that if you look at the PLA, and it was founded in 1927, that within its almost 100-year history, the changes under Xi Jinping have been the most extensive, much more than we saw under Hu Jintao or Deng Xiaoping. The last thing I would say in terms of major inflection points is 2020. I would say it's a major inflection point in terms of thinking about security issues vis-a-vis China, and as well as its foreign policy defense outlook. And two things really make 2022 that significant. First is China's pronouncement of a no limits partnership with Russia. And then, of course, China's support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all the fallout from that, and what that means in terms of China's alignment. Also, the same year, and partially due to China's support of Russia, was all the concern about if China supports that type of activity in Europe, what does that mean in terms of how China thinks about Taiwan? And then Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August of 2022 and the major Chinese military exercise that happened afterwards really showcased in the international community a new type of normal in China's military activity and aggression towards Taiwan that has really set China on a slightly different trajectory vis-a-vis Taiwan, as well as the international community.
So that is just fascinating. And you hit on a number of issues that I definitely want to come back to. But let me just ask you about one other issue that you didn't mention, which is that of Chinese bases overseas. Because I know that up until, or I should say, I think that up until about 2011, you really didn't see much mention of China having overseas bases. In fact, it seemed to be antithetical to their sort of military doctrine, as far as I could tell. Then all of a sudden, at least I started seeing, articles by experts that, we both know, people like Shanding Li, talking about why shouldn't China have overseas bases. And of course, we saw the first one in Djibouti, the military logistics base. But I have to say, I expected to see more by now. I thought that China had these big, overseas basing ambitions. Do you have a sense for, was I just mistaken in my anticipation that they were going to move very aggressively in this direction, or have they been slowed by some other kinds of factors?
So I think there's still a debate within China on whether having overseas military bases the same way that the United States has ours is actually beneficial to the Chinese. Because on one hand, they don't want the burden that the United States has with our allies and partners. China does not want to be responsible for the defense of another country. China doesn't want to be dragged into conflicts far beyond the Chinese border, which is what they associate some of these military bases with. On the other hand, we do see a PLA that's much more active, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but going beyond. We're seeing a PLA that does a lot more port calls in countries across the world. I would say what the model that China seems to have settled for is investing in a lot of infrastructure that could be dual use. And that infrastructure doesn't have to be called a military base. So it avoids all the burdens of the military base, but still provides China with, for example, the deep water ports that Chinese military vessels can go into, but also provides China with the flexibility to use those bases in a time of crisis. Use those facilities in a time of crisis.
Right. It does seem to be doing something in Cambodia, though, doesn't it? Like I've heard something a little more than just a port.
So there's a short list of countries that the Department of Defense has listed in, I believe, the 2024 annual China military power report, and it's over half a dozen countries of which China is suspected to have interest in having um, a a facility there that could function as a military base. I don't have that list at the top of my head, but Cambodia was one of those countries.
Right.
And
So we,
and the Chinese interest was across. It wasn't just in the Indo-Pacific. It was in countries in Africa, in the Middle East, as well as I believe there were reportings of maybe one or two countries in Latin America. But I need to go back and check that list.
yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think one of them is stuck in my mind for other reasons was the UAE, um,
Mm-hmm.
and so maybe we should keep our eyes open to see whether they make any progress there. But what you're saying is so interesting. I hadn't realized that there was an ongoing debate over whether bases would be beneficial for the reasons that you suggested. So it's really interesting. So let's just like expand that a little bit and give us a sense of China's military capabilities, relative to those of the United States, because we keep hearing, of course, that China now has a larger, navy than the United States does. It's testing hypersonic missiles. I think there's a sense that China's moving very aggressively in a number of different areas in ways that their capabilities maybe in some cases have even surpassed those of the United States. So what's your assessment? And it's not to ask you to go, from one weapon system to the next, but
Yes.
just to give us sort of your broad sense for where the two are, where we have parity, or one is slightly ahead of the other. Can you give us a sort of picture of what that looks like?
Sure. So I guess I would try to simplify it down to hardware, software, and then in addition to capabilities, particularly if we're talking about contingencies, there's also the question of resolve. And then the last dimension I think to think about is friends, allies, and partners. Right. So on the hardware side, I think that's where China has made the most progress. Hardware across the board. There's lots of discussions of how much China has basically tripled it and doubled its missile capability, ballistic missile capabilities. Based on since 2020, we've also seen reports that since 2020, China has also doubled its nuclear weapons count from 300 warheads in 2020 to an estimate 600 warheads this year. We know that China has been constructing significant shelters, changing its military bases, adding runways, adding hardening to basically across military bases across from Taiwan. We also have reports as of this year that China is constructing a massive wartime underground command center near Beijing that's the size of 50 pentagons. So basically, across the board, you can find massive investments on infrastructure, on equipment, and on all the hard capabilities. Now, in terms of what the software, that's where I think China really has a lot of problems. So we haven't seen China fight a war, actual war in decades. And even when we look at the large scale Chinese exercises, we so far haven't seen a very large scale military exercise that's completely unscripted and involve live fires. And as you know, when you're thinking about actual combat, it's all of the above and more complexities involved. So I have serious doubts on how whether the Chinese military leaders are able to perform in actual real combat situations. And we also see what writings by Chinese authors that they have what they call the five incapables. So this is how Chinese authors describe them. The five incapables include one, Chinese commanders not being able to judge situations. Two, not being able to understand higher authority intentions. Three, not being able to make operational decisions. Four, not being able to deploy forces. And five, not being able to manage unexpected situations. That sounds to me that the PLA's commanders are not able to function as commanders. And that this is being widely reported within Chinese language materials about weaknesses within the PLA.
So can I just ask, are these writers, are they scholars, like traditional foreign policy scholars, or are these writers within the PLA or within the Ministry of Defense?
They're writers within the PLA, they're PLA experts, not just foreign policy experts. And this is also reported on in the annual U.S. Department of Defense, sorry, Department of War assessments to Congress as one of the weaknesses from the PLA side. And then
I worry
looking,
sometimes. Sorry, Bonnie.
yeah,
Let me just get your thought on this. I do worry sometimes that as we do in the Chinese economy, that there can be a tendency for us to maybe inflate our capabilities relative to those of China, or just to say, because we know that China has a highly centralized system, that their people in the mid-level won't be able to make split moment decisions. They're going to have to report back to Beijing, in the middle of some kind of, air fight, and therefore they're not going to be successful. Is there any sort of, do you have any concern that when you would read a Department of Defense, and I still call it the Department of Defense because I think technically they don't have approval to call it Department of War, but Department of Defense, writings that might be the case, or do you think that these are actually these criticisms are well taken?
I think that these criticisms are well taken. They're criticisms that we've we are basically reporting on based off of PLA assessments, experts within the Chinese system that are assessing the PLA. And I would add that I worry that these issues may have been further exacerbated under the current PLA purges. Because if you look at the Xi Jinping's purges of the PLA, if you are a mid to low commander in the PLA and you're looking at all the people who are purged above you, and one of the criticisms of those folks purged above you is either allegations of corruption, which you can allege corruption almost any official in China,
Right.
and then other allegations of forming these coalitions or different loyalties, not necessarily to Xi Jinping. If you look at that and look at the extent of the purges, I don't think it incentivizes lower or mid-level commanders to say, let me take the initiative and do something. I think it incentivizes them to keep their heads down so that they won't be purged, so they won't attract any of the discipline, any of the, I guess, questions about their own discipline.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. And let me actually then let's turn to the issue of purges,
Mhm.
because I have to say, even I'm surprised about this.
Yeah,
I've seen it in other sectors, cyber, where officials that Xi Jinping has appointed are now being purged. So it's not a matter of once he's brought you into the senior most position that you're safe.
right.
But as you say, they can look back 20 years and find an example of corruption and, go after you for that. But do we actually have any understanding of why this most recent batch of senior military officials, was purged? Or do we understand it? You mentioned, sort of loyalties outside of, I
Right.
guess, the party and Xi Jinping, and not maybe respecting the sort of the party as opposed to the military, or putting military professionalism perhaps over the party. Do you have any thoughts about what's going on in this particular last purge?
Yeah, so I'll share, I guess, three different theories for it. And I guess I probably believe more in the first or second one, and the third is a bit more outlandish, but it's circulated. I'll just say that. So the first theory, and actually, you can listen to my podcast with John Culver where he talks about this.
Will
Uh,
do.
is basically that it's really hard for us to tell from the outside what is causing these purges. It is probably a combination of different factors for different types of purges. Some could be for corruption, some could be loyalty, but on the outside, you really can't tell, well, is this based on corruption? Is this based on loyalty? Is this based on competence? And here John really points to the purges that have been pretty systematic. He tracked over 2 dozen purges of top PLA leadership, and it's across all 5 military regions. With exception of the Southern Theater Command, all the commanders of each of the 4 military regions have been purged. But if you look one level below the commanders, you see that the political commissars, every single political commissar from across the right below the commander across 5 military regions have been purged. So doesn't seem to be, if you look at how systematic it is, it's hard to say it is just caused by one particular factor. So that's one theory. The other theory, which I think is well documented by excellent work from Neil Thomas and others, are there are factions within the PLA, and the faction that is winning out is more of the Shanxi faction that is closer to where the current, the remaining vice chair of the CMC is, and not necessarily Zhang Youxia, and not the vice chairman of the CMC that was recently purged, which is He Weidong. So in this argument is that He Weidong, Miao Hua, and others within the PLA system, Lin Xiangyang, most of them have at one point in their careers worked within the Fujian system, either at Fujian or within the current or former Eastern Theater Command. And because they grew up through this system where they worked at Fujian one point or another, they actually formed their own clique within the PLA that was opposed and to the other clique led by Zhang Youxia. And Zhang Youxia has sort of won this internal factionism, so that's why He Weidong and others are out the door. But to your point, Liz, earlier about how some of the folks within the PLA were promoted by Xi Jinping, He Weidong is one of the folks who were promoted by Xi Jinping. And some of the other folks that are also out were also promoted very fast by Xi Jinping, which is why there's a third theory, which I don't quite buy because we see no other evidence of, but it's being, I guess, shared by some princelings in China and also shared on Chinese social media, which is that Zhang Youxia is winning out the internal PLA struggles, and he is able to get rid of all of the folks who are loyal to Xi Jinping, and he's actually trying to force Xi Jinping to accept a term limit. But again, that's a pretty radical theory. Yeah.
That is a very radical theory.
Yeah, it's a pretty radical theory. And the only evidence that these people can point to is that Zhang Youxia has lasted out the purges. And the argument is if he's remaining and he's still in power, that means he still has power, which means that he's gotten rid of his enemies. But I don't know how that really relates to forcing Xi Jinping to accept term limits. So that's why I don't really believe in that theory. But again, that speaks to how much we don't know, because a lot of these folks who rose up very fast in the system were Xi's proteges, right? People he promoted very fast, which is why some were asking, well, why did then after promoting him, then he within a couple of years just gets rid of them? But I think one thing that we do see from the PLA purges that I think is relatively fact-based, it doesn't really matter what theory you believe in, is that a lot of the folks who are now being purged from the system or have been recently purged did start their careers or at one point or another spent a good portion of their careers in Fujian, which means that if they are purged, China is losing a significant portion of experts that have a lot of expertise on operations vis-a-vis Taiwan. Which then raises questions if China does want to engage in another large-scale military exercise or large-scale military operation vis-a-vis Taiwan, how much existing expertise is still within the PLA system, and how do the remaining leaders think about operations against Taiwan? The other fact I think that is well known, and you probably know this because this coincided with your most recent stint in government, which is that He Weidong, the outed vice chairman of the CMC, he was largely responsible for the very flashy displays of PLA power against Taiwan during then Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So one other theory that's being circulated is He Weidong may have been outed because he was too supportive of these very large demonstrations of military force, and Zhang Youxia wants the PLA to continue to build on its capabilities and not demonstrate the force in the same way.
I mean, so many different theories flying around. it's difficult to make sense of some of them. Like, I have to say, I perhaps the one I find most puzzling is the idea that Zhang Youxia is still there because he's trying to enforce a term limit on Xi Jinping. Did I understand that correctly?
So the argument, some argue that Zhang Youxia is still there, which means that he still has power and he's still powerful. And I don't really know how that relates to Zhang Yixia trying to force a term limit on Xi Jinping. But those are things that I've heard all in one big group batch. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, as someone who focuses primarily on the political side, it's very difficult to imagine that if Xi Jinping had somebody underneath him who was trying to enforce term limits on him, that he wouldn't by now have gotten rid of that person as opposed to everybody else around him, because
Exactly.
he does hold the sword when it comes to lopping off the heads of the people, in
Right.
these senior military positions. So that one doesn't make so much sense. I guess for me, what I always find interesting, and this applies not only to the military, but more broadly to these purges, is the difference in the language around the ones that seem to be entirely about corruption, which is very clear, and then the ones where the reasoning seems to be a little bit more murky, and there seems to be
Right.
some kind of political issue behind it, and what that might be, whether if you have an entire clique of Fujian PLA officials, what was it, were they saying things that Xi Jinping didn't like about the potential for a Taiwan action, or who knows, right? I mean, we could just sit and speculate all day long. It's probably not that fruitful, but I think it's an important enough issue that
Right.
I think we should all be thinking hard about what's actually going on
Hmm.
behind the scenes there. But thank you for sketching out sort of what's in the minds of both people inside China and top scholars like yourself who focus on this issue. Okay, so let's move to our third issue, which is Taiwan, and an area that you are certainly one of our country's leading experts on Taiwan and on sort of relations between the mainland and Taiwan and the U.S. and broader regional security issues. So, okay, let's just get right to it, because there seems to be just an insatiable appetite, for the question of, whether or not Xi Jinping is, committed to, claiming sovereignty over Taiwan in a real sense, whether that 2027 deadline for the PLA being ready, has any material significance. How do you understand Xi Jinping's objective, when it comes to Taiwan? Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that he has at least one more term in him, and we probably could agree on that 2027 is not going to see Xi Jinping moving himself into retirement. So let's say he's got one more term as general secretary from 2027 to 2032, and after that, probably maybe would take a back seat, chairman of the party or something, retained chairman of the Central Military Commission. But most importantly, one big 5 year term left in him. What do you think he wants by the time he actually leaves that position?
And that's an excellent question. So by 2032, the end of the potential Xi fourth term, he would be 79 years old. And I think I found the hot mic moment between Xi Jinping and Putin in September when they were talking about how people can live to 150 years to be interesting, because that made me wonder if Xi really wants a fifth term or maybe a sixth term. Because if you believe you can live to 150, 80 is not that old, right? But having said that, I personally do believe Xi Jinping, if possible, wants unification with Taiwan during his term, before he leaves office. But if you look at all the official documents, they all said rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049. So Xi Jinping has not boxed himself in to necessarily have to unify with Taiwan before he leaves office. But if you look at the 2022 China's new white paper on Taiwan, it very clearly spells out why China needs to unify with Taiwan. So the exact language in there is that national unification is the only way to avoid the risk of Taiwan being invaded and occupied again by foreign countries, to foil the attempts of external forces to contain China, and to safeguard Taiwan and to safeguard the sovereignty, security, and development interests of our country. So, from China's perspective and from Xi Jinping's perspective, unless Taiwan can be brought back to the motherland, China can't continue rising. Taiwan will always be used by the United States or another foreign power to check China. And China cannot be as powerful as it needs to be both in the Indo-Pacific as well as in the world globally. So I think it's very much central to how Xi Jinping views China's rejuvenation.
So what does that look like? Does that mean it's a one country, two systems? Does it mean that he's just made progress in terms of closer ties? You know, look at the new head of the new chairperson of the Kuomintang, right, who was just
Mhm.
elected, who, you know, speaks in terms of, you know, Taiwan and the mainland's, you know, vision for the future being the same, right, and working together. Is it enough to have people like that in power who align Taiwan's interests with those of the mainland, or does it actually have to be, you know, a you know where Taiwan no longer has, you know, an independent foreign policy, has elections? What does that look like in your mind?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I did a look at what terms and conditions Xi Jinping would be able to accept in Taiwan compared to what his predecessors were able to accept. And if you look at the outline of, for example, what Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin were willing to accept, you actually saw that they were quite willing to accept that Taiwan could keep its political system largely intact, that Taiwan may even be able to have its own military forces, that Taiwan might also be able to conduct some form of foreign policy if there is a recognition of sort of Taiwan's role subordinate to the central government of China. But under Xi Jinping, and I think this is also quite impacted by how he saw dynamics in Hong Kong, you don't have Chinese leaders saying that Taiwan can keep its military anymore, or Chinese scholars or writers talking about that under Xi Jinping. You don't have any discussion about how Taiwan could keep its political system or its legal system in place anymore. And it's becoming very clear that only patriots can become the leaders of Taiwan, just as we saw only patriots can now be appointed leaders of Hong Kong. So the terms for which Taiwan can be unified with China are much more stringent now under Xi, because he's worried that if he does make progress in Taiwan, Taiwan experience similar things as Hong Kong, waves of protest, and that will challenge Chinese rule, and he doesn't want that again.
Right.
Having said that, I don't know what she wants to achieve or thinks it's possible by 2032. I mean, ideally, it would be Taiwan in a similar under a similar degree of control as Hong Kong, but he might be okay, for example, if they have a if there is a KMT leader who's very much pro-China and sees a path towards integration between Taiwan and the mainland politically. I think that might be acceptable. I think there's a difference between what he would ideally like and what is politically feasible. But what I don't see is, for example, if we continue to have DPP leaders win the Taiwan presidency, that would be acceptable for Xi Jinping, particularly as it gets closer to the end of his fourth term.
And so given that, you left me hanging right there. So given that, does that then mean if, you know, in 2028, when the DPP, when the Taiwan has its next election, if another DPP candidate, you know, say William Lai is elected for a second term, does that then, in your mind, force Xi Jinping's hand to take some kind of military action? Because, you know, they're both going to be, you know, finishing close to 2032. I mean, what does that look like then? I mean,
I do worry that the late 2027, 2028 is a very dangerous period in cross-strait relations for all the wrong reasons that the original 2027 was attributed to. But to your point, I do worry that if the CCP sees that another DPP leader, they might actually come to the assessment that the prospects for peaceful unification with Taiwan is out the door. And if that is out the door, it leaves open a lot of questions on what are the options for Beijing. And here, I'm not sure necessarily the military option would be the first one. It depends on how close the election results are. If the results are very close, we could see a renewed campaign to destabilize the DPP, which we've seen here. We've saw in the past year or so massive recall campaigns, both the DPP on the KMT and KMT vice versa. We could see that accelerate. We could see gray zone, significant Chinese gray zone operations against Taiwan, so such as a quarantine or a blockade that does not necessarily mean a lead up to an invasion. I do think as China is looking at the prospects for invading Taiwan, they are recognizing that it's incredibly costly. That's a capability and option China wants to have, but it's not anywhere clear as a first resort option for China.
Yeah. So, one thing I did want to ask you about, and then we'll just go to our quick, wrap up questions.
Yeah.
You raised the issue of China and Russia, and of course, then you'd expand to that kind of Iran and North Korea. How concerned are you about this alignment that we've seen emerge, around and in support of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine? And, does it signal something new to you in terms of China's willingness to play in a different way? They're not alliances, I guess. Well, they do have a formal alliance, right? A treaty alliance with North Korea, but certainly
Right.
not with Russia. But does it say anything new about the way that we should think about China working with others in the future in security and military ways?
Sure. I think a couple of things there. If you talk to the Russia experts before 2022, I don't think anyone would have predicted the way Russia has strengthened its relationship. The fact that Russia has signed a agreement with Iran, the way Russia has signed a security agreement with North Korea. I think some might say that they could have predicted some North Korean troops in Ukraine because Russia has always had North Korean workers in Russia. But I think most would probably not have predicted the exact extent to which Russia paid for North Korean troops in Ukraine. And I think very few would have predicted that Russia was willing to give many of its military crown jewels to China, for example, on helping China with its nuclear submarine technology, but also providing China with capabilities that could be directly relevant to an invasion of Taiwan. In some ways, as payment for all the economic support China has provided Russia, as well as dual use equipment. So the main lesson learned for me from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is once you have a war situation, it really changes the calculations of the state that is engaged in that conflict, and it makes that state potentially more willing to give to other countries, both in terms of payment as well as deals. And then it provides this opportunity for other countries to deepen friendship, deepen relationship, but also provide support. So when I look at that in the context of China, I don't think what China provided Russia was necessarily that surprising. But if China were to take those lessons learned from Russia, and if China were to engage in a war with Taiwan, particularly a protracted war in which China is not doing as well, we could see China in a similar situation as Russia, as being more willing to offer things to Russia, to North Korea, to Iran, to ask them to help China. And that's where I feel like we need to use our imagination a little bit and not think that because China hasn't been willing to offer X, Y, and Z, China won't do so if finds itself in a more dire situation.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. Just that now this is a new, not a new mechanism exactly, but that we could see something similar emerge around Taiwan. That China has other countries that it can call on for
Right.
support in different kinds of ways. I think that is a really important lesson to take from Russia's experience in Ukraine. And now Russia owes China to some extent, and you could imagine that it would find ways to support China. So it just adds to the complexity, certainly for I think U.S. military planners as they're thinking about Taiwan, and for Taiwanese themselves, of course, Taiwanese contingencies. Okay, so let's go to our sort of quick 4 questions, broaden out our the range of things we're going to discuss a little bit, and just quickly, if you were going to sort of nominate one book or one article that you think our listeners should read, what would it be? What do you think is most important, or what's top of mind for you?
Um, this is going to sound a little weird, but as a China analyst, I think sometimes what I don't understand the most these days is US policy. So, what I'm going to recommend that I found most useful to understanding the Trump administration's policies is Robert O'Brien's recent Foreign Affairs article, The Case of Trump's Second Term Foreign Policy. I read that and I think it help me connect quite a bit of dots and also helps me understand sort of the internal logic with how folks in the Trump team think about their foreign policy.
Okay, excellent, excellent suggestion. I read the Bolton uh, and McMaster's books for the same reason
Mhm.
over the summer, and I think it's useful to get those kinds of insights from people who have served with the president in the past. Okay, what do we not know? I mean, I guess in your space, you know, there's so much, but what do we not know about China that we need to know? Like, what if you could pick one thing and say, I could get access to this sort of set of facts or information, this is what I would want to know that we don't know about China. What's most important?
I think what would be most important for me as an analyst of China's security and defense policy would be to understand what is driving all the PLA purges. Because if we know why certain people are being purged, whether it's mainly for loyalty issues, for competency issues, for disagreement and policy issues, we would have a better sense of both where the PLA is going, but also Xi Jinping's priorities.
Yeah, I agree with you. And even not being a sort of military security specialist, I would put that close to the top of my list of things I'd want to know as well. Okay, now let's pretend that you are sitting at the right hand of President Trump and you have served in the Defense Department before. What advice would you give him? Like, what's again top of mind for you as you're looking at U.S. policy and security policy toward China? What would you say this is the number one thing that you really need to do?
I think that's a really difficult question. Uh, I guess maybe the one thing that we really should be doing is trying to capitalize on Chinese mistakes. And I think recently China made a pretty big move with all its rare earth export controls. And I think, I mean, of course, President Trump has been going around to various allies and partners trying to secure more rare earth deals, working with our allies and partners. But I think this mistake is actually one that could unify us with our allies partners a lot more, and we should be capitalizing it to make sure to showcase to the Chinese that they overplay their hand, and if they play this again, which I think they're going to continue to do, it's going to only unify us with our allies and partners more because there's a lot of ways in which China is trying to divide us from our closest allies and partners. But this one tool that China is using is something that all of our closest allies and partners are really, really worried about.
So is your suggestion that we sort of broaden the range of issues on which we're working with our allies and partners to demonstrate this, you know, cooperation and collaboration, or is it that we find new ways in this space around rare earth elements to cooperate?
I think both. Definitely both. We do see the Trump administration on security front, particularly at the secretary level, doing a lot more with our allies and partners. But at the presidential level, we also see President Trump emphasizing that. But when it comes to US-China relations, it's quite puzzling to me that President Trump does not seem to mention security issues directly with Xi Jinping.
Yeah. Right. That's a good point. I mean, I guess the most recent meeting was really just about the trade issue, which we know is
Right.
his number one priority. But it is important that we see Secretary Hegseth out there, I think, as you're referencing in a number of
Mhm.
occasions, frankly, over the past several months, really talking about the challenge that China presents in the region and the importance of all of our allies and partners stepping up and working together. So um,
Right.
yeah, I agree with you. All right, then last, on a scale of 1 to 10, we have a sort of summit meeting coming up in Beijing in April. On a scale of 1 to 10, what do you think is the likelihood that we have a new, you know, Nixon Mao moment between President Trump and President Xi Jinping, some real breakthrough in the US-China relationship.
In April 2026 or during Trump's tenure?
Okay, well, all right. I was thinking April 2026, but we can include all of President Trump's in the next 3 years.
Okay. I think April 2026 is 2%. I don't want to say zero, but 2%. Let's give
Okay.
it some optimism there. But under President Trump's tenure, maybe the maximum 30, 40%. But that's really high, and that might be very optimistic. I give it, I think it's high because I think President Trump has big ambitions and wants to have some form of deal with China as with any other country, and his use of the term G2 to characterize his recent meeting with Xi Jinping, I think, showcases that desire. I think it's low on the 30% because I don't think Xi is interested in doing that. When you talk about, for example, Mao and Nixon, China was in a completely different place during the Cold War. That China was the weaker of three powers and was looking to increase its hand and leverage against a Soviet Union that it viewed as its large main adversary. Right now, China views the United States as its main adversary, main competitor. So I don't think it's necessarily Xi's interest to have this grand deal with President Trump, even if he wants one, because I think Xi wants to be number one. So.
That I think is an important point, but maybe I just suggest that if that big deal involves somehow trading out Taiwan security, Xi might be interested in that deal.
I think he might be interested in that deal. And I think that's why I did have the percentage around 30, because I do think President Trump would probably be interested in a deal like that. Because if you look at his almost first year, he has really prided himself in stopping wars, preventing wars from happening. And if you think about a effort that could win him the Nobel Peace Prize, I think Taiwan would be high up there.
Yes, although I don't really think that trading out Taiwan is going to get him the Nobel Peace Prize.
But I think
I'm
he
pretty
thinks
sure
that
the
is.
Nobel Committee would not reward President Trump with the Nobel Peace Prize if he said we are no longer going to sell arms to Taiwan and we support unification with the mainland immediately. I don't think that the Nobel Committee would give him that. But anyway, so.
I think his argument would probably be he's preventing war between US and China, and that's why he might think. So I'm not arguing whether that's true or not. I'm just saying, like, looking at his logic, I think he would want that to be solving the issue between the United States and China that would most likely bring the two sides to war at any time in the future.
Okay, well, this is what I have to say, Bonnie. I'm going to have you on every year at this time, and we can assess your answer to that question and see whether things have moved along, in that direction or not. But really, I want to thank you just for a fantastic discussion, and your mastery both of the big picture and the details is really incredible. And so, thank you for sharing all of that with us today.
Oh, thank you very much, Liz, for having me on. And it's always a pleasure to be in the same platform as you.
So if you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more reasoned discourse and debate on China, I encourage you to subscribe to China Considered via the Hoover Institution YouTube channel or the podcast platform of your choice.